June 1942. London. American generals arrived in Britain expecting to find a defeated nation on its knees. Instead, they found something that changed how they understood courage forever. Major General Dwight Eisenhower stepped off the train at Paddington Station and saw a city that looked like it had been used for target practice. The station's great glass roof had gaping holes patched with tarps. Entire blocks nearby were just rubble and weeds. 2 years after the bombs fell, a red double-decker bus rolled past with windows boarded up in plywood. The people on the sidewalk walked with purpose, dressed in threadbare coats, faces lean from rationing. They glanced at his crisp American uniform with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been nothing at all. They'd seen too much to be impressed by a general's stars. Eisenhower had come to take command of American forces in Europe, to build the alliance that would eventually invade Hitler's fortress. He'd read the reports, studied the maps, knew the statistics, but nothing had prepared him for the physical reality of a nation that had been fighting alone for 2 years. Every building told a story. Every face carried weight. This wasn't the Britain of his imagination, the empire of pomp and ceremony. This was something harder, something forged in fire that wouldn't break. 2 years earlier, in June 1940, Britain faced the most desperate moment in its 1,000-year history. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its heavy equipment. Norway was lost. The Low Countries were lost. The Channel Islands would fall within days. Every major European power, except neutral Switzerland and Sweden, was now either conquered by Nazi Germany or allied with it. Britain stood alone against a German war machine that had just crushed the combined armies of France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands in 46 days. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for barely a month, addressed Parliament on June 4th. The situation was catastrophic. 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in France. Thousands of tons of ammunition, 1,000 guns, all the army's tanks and transport vehicles left behind on French beaches. Britain now faced invasion with a battered army, a handful of divisions, and a coastline impossible to fully defend. German generals were already planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. They had 4 million men under arms, 3,000 tanks, and complete control of the European coastline from Norway to Spain. The Luftwaffe had over 3,000 aircraft. Britain's Royal Air Force had fewer than 700 operational fighters. In Washington, American military planners gave Britain 3 weeks, maybe 6 if they were lucky. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, watching from London, sent cables saying British defeat was inevitable, and America shouldn't tie its future to a sinking ship. But the British government didn't seek terms. Instead, they prepared to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. They removed road signs to confuse invaders. They built pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles. They armed the Home Guard with whatever weapons could be found, including pikes and shotguns. The first test came in the skies. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe began probing attacks. In August, they shifted to attacking airfields and aircraft factories. The Battle of Britain had begun. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed he could destroy the RAF in 4 days and clear the way for invasion. The RAF pilots were outnumbered 3-1. Many were barely 20 years old. They flew Hurricanes and Spitfires in 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day. They took off, climbed to 20,000 feet, fought for their lives, landed, refueled, rearmed, and went back up. The statistics were merciless. Fighter Command lost over 500 pilots killed or wounded between July and October. New pilots arrived with 10 hours of training and were dead within a week. But the RAF kept flying. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of attacking airfields, they would attack London, break civilian morale, make the people demand surrender. That first night, 300 bombers dropped 300 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiary bombs on London's East End. The docks burned. Warehouses full of rum, sugar, paint, and timber created firestorms visible 50 miles away. 430 civilians died. 1,600 were seriously injured. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers attacked London. People descended into underground stations, basement shelters, coal cellars. They lay in the dark, listening to bombs whistle down, explosions crump, buildings collapse. The bombers came and went unopposed while German fighters dropped bombs on undefended people.
The bombers targeted more than London. Coventry was hit by 500 bombers in a single night. The medieval city center destroyed. The cathedral reduced to a shell. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Belfast, Plymouth, Southampton, all were hammered. The Luftwaffe dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs on Britain in 8 months. Over 43,000 civilians were killed. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. The British people did not demand surrender. They developed a grim routine. Sleep in the shelters, emerge at dawn, check if your house still existed, go to work if you could get there, queue for rations, avoid the unexploded bombs marked with red flags. Women worked in munitions factories, in the land army growing food, in auxiliary services. They drove ambulances through burning streets during raids. They pulled survivors from rubble. They staffed anti-aircraft batteries and flew transport planes. Rationing was severe. Meat, butter, sugar, tea, eggs, cheese, all rationed from early 1940. The average adult's weekly ration included 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 8 ounces of sugar, and 1 fresh egg, maybe. Bananas disappeared entirely. Oranges became a rare luxury. People lost weight. The average British civilian lost between 10 and 15 pounds during the war. Clothing wore out and couldn't be replaced. Coats were turned inside out and re-sewn. Women drew lines up the backs of their bare legs with eyebrow pencil to simulate stockings they couldn't buy. And through all of this, Britain kept fighting. In North Africa, British forces battled Italian armies. At sea, the Royal Navy fought to keep supply lines open. German U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping in 1941 alone. In the air, Bomber Command began striking back at Germany. The raids were small, inaccurate, costly, but they kept flying. America watched with a mixture of admiration and doubt. President Roosevelt wanted to help. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, allowed America to supply Britain with weapons and supplies. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, and tons of food crossed the Atlantic. But America was still neutral. Many American military officers were skeptical of British chances. They saw the defeats in France, Greece, Crete, the early disasters in North Africa. Some respected British determination. Others saw it as stubbornness, a refusal to face reality. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Japan's surprise attack brought America into the war instantly. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Suddenly, Britain had an ally with industrial might that dwarfed Germany's. But American forces weren't ready. Building the force that could invade Europe would take years. In the meantime, American generals and staff officers began arriving in Britain to plan the eventual offensive. They arrived expecting to find a country on its knees, grateful for rescue. They found something very different.
General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, visited Britain in April 1942. He toured bombed cities, visited military bases, met with British commanders. He was struck by the absence of defeatism. These were people who'd been bombed for months, who'd lost sons and husbands, who were living on rations that would have caused riots in America. They weren't beaten. They were angry, determined, and very, very tired of fighting alone. Eisenhower arrived in June and took command of American forces in the European theater. His first impressions, recorded in letters and later in his memoirs, showed a man grappling with the gap between expectation and reality. He'd expected war weariness. He found resilience. He'd expected people desperate for American help. He found people who were glad of the help, but who'd been managing without it for 2 years and knew exactly what they were doing. Eisenhower walked through London streets in the evenings against his security detail's advice. He saw bomb damage everywhere. Entire blocks reduced to rubble. Buildings with their fronts blown off, exposing rooms like dollhouses. Churches that were just shells, open to the sky. Families living in partially destroyed homes, cooking on camp stoves, hanging laundry between broken walls. One incident stayed with him. He was visiting a factory in the Midlands that had been bombed twice. The roof was patched with corrugated metal. The windows were blown out and covered with canvas. The machinery was old, some of it damaged and repaired. The workers, mostly women, were producing tank parts on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Eisenhower asked the factory manager how morale was. The man looked at him with surprise. "Morale, sir? We're winning, aren't we? We're still here. Jerry's not." That was the British attitude in a sentence. We're still here. That alone was victory. General Carl Spaatz arrived to command the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe and began working with RAF Bomber Command. He was impressed and appalled in equal measure. Impressed by the professionalism, the courage, the determination to take the war to Germany despite horrific losses. Appalled by the losses themselves. Bomber Command was losing 5% of its aircraft on every mission. Crews had a 30% chance of surviving a 30-mission tour. They kept flying. Spaatz met Lancaster crews who'd flown 20, 25 missions. They were in their early 20s but looked 40. They joked about their odds. They talked about friends who'd gone down over the Ruhr, over Hamburg, over Berlin. Then they went and did it again the next night. American airmen arriving in Britain in late 1942 and early 1943 got a crash course in what sustained combat actually meant. Every technique, every procedure, every piece of advice came from someone who'd learned it the hard way or died learning it. Not all American reactions were admiring. George Patton, arriving in 1942, had a complicated relationship with the British. He respected their courage, but thought they were too cautious, too slow, too willing to consolidate instead of exploit. His diary entries showed grudging respect mixed with frustration about British officers who'd been fighting for 3 years and were tired. But even Patton recognized what Britain had endured. He visited Coventry and walked through the destroyed city center. He saw the cathedral, its walls still standing, but the roof gone. He saw streets of rubble,
gaps where buildings had been, people living in wreckage. He wrote that any nation that could take this and keep fighting deserved respect. The respect went both ways. British soldiers and civilians had mixed feelings about Americans arriving. The phrase, overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, became common, a mixture of resentment and humor. American soldiers were paid far more than British soldiers. They had access to luxuries, cigarettes, chocolate, nylon stockings that had disappeared from British shops years ago. But the British recognized that American entry meant eventual victory. The industrial might, the resources, the sheer scale of American mobilization meant Germany would eventually be overwhelmed. Eisenhower proved to be a brilliant diplomat as well as a general. He understood the alliance required compromise, that British experience and American strength needed combining. He worked closely with British commanders, particularly General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery had taken over 8th Army when it was reeling from defeats and turned it into a winning force. He planned meticulously, built up overwhelming strength, and only attacked when certain of success. This drove Patton crazy. Eisenhower learned to manage both men, using Montgomery's methodical approach and Patton's aggressive instincts in combination. The first test came in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch involved American and British forces landing in Morocco and Algeria. American forces in their first real combat made mistakes. They were outfought by German forces. But British forces, veterans of the Desert War, provided experience and backbone that kept the campaign moving. By May 1943, North Africa was won. It was a genuine Allied victory, American and British forces working together, learning to coordinate, building the relationship that would eventually invade Europe.
During this period, American generals continued being struck by what they found in Britain. They saw the ration books, the worn clothing, the exhaustion. They saw people who'd been at war for 5 years, who'd been bombed, who'd sent their children away for safety, who'd lived with blackouts and constant fear, and who'd never quit. The respect between British and American forces was demonstrated in D-Day planning. Eisenhower was Supreme Commander, but his deputy was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, British. Montgomery commanded all ground forces. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, British, commanded naval forces. It was genuinely integrated, American and British staff working together, planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. The invasion on June 6, 1944, involved over 150,000 troops on the first day, American, British, and Canadian. It succeeded because of that integration. American industrial might and British experience combined into something greater than either alone. By that point, Britain had been at war for nearly 5 years. The country was exhausted, strained to breaking point, but still fighting. American generals who'd arrived in 1942 skeptical of British capabilities had learned to respect what Britain had accomplished. Eisenhower, in his memoirs written after the war, reflected on what he'd learned from the British. He wrote about their resilience, their determination, their refusal to be beaten. He wrote about the courage of civilians as much as soldiers, about women working in factories, children evacuated, families living in bomb shelters. He wrote that America had entered the war confident in its strength, but that Britain had taught them about endurance. When American generals said they were impressed by Britain fighting alone for 2 years and never quitting, they weren't offering empty praise. They were recognizing something profound. They were recognizing that Britain had held the line when no one else could or would, that Britain had taken everything Nazi Germany could throw at it and remained standing. Britain had looked into the abyss and decided jumping in wasn't an option. They would stand on the edge, however precarious, however terrifying, and they would hold until help arrived. Help did arrive, in the form of American power and Soviet sacrifice. Together, the Allies won. But in those 2 years fighting alone, Britain won something perhaps more important. It won the right to say it had never quit, never surrendered, never stopped fighting. and American generals arriving in a battered but unbroken nation understood they were witnessing something remarkable. Not the empire of old, but something harder and more essential. A people who decided some things were worth any sacrifice, and proved it with blood, fire, and unbreakable will. That mutual respect, that recognition of what each brought to the alliance, that was part of what made victory possible. Not just tanks and planes and ships, but the understanding that they were fighting for something worth preserving, something Britain had defended alone when defending it seemed impossible. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We tell forgotten stories of courage and sacrifice every week here at Battlefield Chronicles. Thanks for watching.